We're kindly joined by Peter Jensen, who's in Wellington. He's been in several crucial meetings over the last couple of days. Very good evening to you, Peter. Thanks so much for your time, these times that can only really be described as extraordinary.
Absolutely correct. I think unprecedented. That's the situation that none of us have had to deal with anything like this before. And to some extent, you have to make the rules up as you go. But I think we've got good guidance from the government in terms of their expectations from the Ministry of Health. And of course, there's a lot of precedent created in terms of what's happening elsewhere in the world, both in racing and in sport.
It's obviously imperative, Peter, at this stage, if we can, to keep our sport going, and one of the few sports that around the world is being continued at the moment, that we can continue to get returns in and therefore distribute them amongst our participants.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's the nature of our business. That's how we operate. It's based on wagering. Everybody understands that. That's where the state money comes from. But of course, the first priority has got to be the health and well-being of our participants, and that's why we're looking to exclude anyone that doesn't need to be on a course won't be on a course. And the reason for that is essentially to keep people safe. The less people that are about, the less risk that we impose. We know that that's not commonly popular with everybody, and particularly with owners. And Friday night's a good example. We've got such a big meeting, and people want to be there to see their horse race and big races, as I would as an owner. And I am an owner with a horseman and a much smaller meeting on Sunday where I'd like to be there. But the reality is, we're doing what's right because we're trying to protect the future of the industry, and of course we're trying to protect the welfare of our participants.
Peter, the rules from the government suggest that we can't have groups of people of more than 500 on track. If we use a number off the top of my head, and it's impossible to quantify because it depends on how many horses are going to the races, but if we use a number that, say, 200 people are needed to run a race meeting, is there any room for other people to come along? For example, if you opened spectators at Addington as an area separate from the horse people to let 200 owners come watch their horses, or does that just get too complicated? Is it simply a case now that it's just easier and safer to make it essential personnel only?
Yeah, like you've summed it up well, Mike. It is easier and it's safer. So if you, as an example, if we opened spectators and the Witcher Syndicate came, then there's your 200 people tied up in one hit. So how do you differentiate one owner from the next in a situation like that? And the same applies to sponsors. I've had calls around sponsors, and they're a really important part of the industry. But I think everybody understands what we're proposing is not out of line with what everybody else is doing. What we're seeing with harness racing Victoria this week, harness racing New South Wales. We will have seen British horse racing was closed down last night, and that came after the decision that we made. So look, we've just got to do the right thing to give us every opportunity to be able to race as long as we can.
Peter, you're in Wellington and therefore you are having probably intelligence or meetings from government agencies which people watching this show aren't able to get directly. We know in advance some other sports have been told. Things, for example, like about the 14-day quarantine periods, and now there's also talk about the borders being closed. What are you hearing that could impact harness racing participants in particular in the near future?
I think probably the two real risks. One, of course, is that somebody from within the industry contracts COVID-19, and so that'll be more decisions to make if we get to that point. And the second one, of course, is if the 500 limit went to 50, for example, and we're hearing that's happening in other parts of the world, then it'd be pretty difficult to run a race meeting if we couldn't have more than 50 people there. So I think that's probably the two key risk areas for us going forward at present.
Okay, Peter, say for example, and we're hoping this doesn't happen, but a stable hand who heads to Addington on Friday night tests positive or for coronavirus next Wednesday. And again, we're talking about hypotheticals, but we're trying to answer questions in people's minds. What happens then? Because I know there's a fear among some people if one industry participant goes down, then the industry can have to shut down. But of course, that doesn't really gel with the rest of the real world. If one plumber in West Auckland goes down, they don't shut down the entire plumbing industry. So what happens if a person in racing, to the best of your knowledge, was to contract or show signs of the coronavirus? What would happen next And is there any contingencies in play for that?
Yeah, so I think what we need to do is take advice in those situations. We're not medical professionals, so we would certainly be looking to take advice. And the example you give is a good one. So what it might do, for example, is affect one area as opposed to all racing, one island as opposed to the other. I guess what we need to be able to do, and one of the reasons for being able to limit the number of people on course is we want to be able to trace everybody that was on course. So it gives us the opportunity to better understand what contact may or may not have happened. And it's a similar situation if you think about it when we're reading with people on planes, that they're not looking to contact everybody that was on the plane. What they're looking to do is to say, well, who was within 2 rows of that person? So those are the sort of things we need to take into consideration. And as I say, the number one thing is that we would take advice. There certainly won't be any knee-jerk reaction to close down all racing on the basis of one person contracting COVID-19.
We see in the thoroughbred industry, Peter, that they have basically quarantined each island. So a jockey who lives in the North Island cannot ride in the South Island. We haven't done that yet. I realise it's done to keep the two industries in separate pods, more or less, as much as you can. Why has harness racing not moved to that?
Look, we did consider it. I think that the key difference between us and thoroughbreds is the very small pool of jockeys they have available, and clearly that's related to that not many of us can walk around at 52 or 53 kilos, so we have a much wider pool of participants available, and probably less movement too. We've got a few drivers that move regularly between the islands and some trainers for the feature meetings, but we understand why thoroughbreds went down that path. But we're happy with the decision that we've made. There's no advice from the government about not travelling. I flew this morning on a full plane from Christchurch to Wellington. Your viewers will be pleased to know that I was on a Jetstar flight. And I would expect when I fly home again this evening, it'll also be a full flight or close to it.
Peter, what happens, for example, I know the TAB are doing modelling and they've lost sports betting from overseas. That's already going to enormously affect the bottom line for next season. What models have you heard and what information have you been given by the TAB about distribution in the future? Because a lot of people out there are wondering, how's this going to affect me? Are stakes going to go down? Are we going to have less race meetings? What can you tell us about the economics or the models you've seen about the economics of the potential effect as it stands now, as we look at maybe April 13 with no spectators? We know, Peter, this can change in the future, but what are you being told at the moment?
Look, to be fair, that we know the TAB's done a huge amount of work, and Dean McKenzie, the executive chair, is meeting with the co-chairs tomorrow to give them an update on exactly what you're talking about there, Mick. So we'll have a better sense of what that looks like. But of course, in the end, it's only scenario analysis at present because we don't actually know where we're going to end up. But I think it would be naive to think that there wasn't some impact on income because the reality is, as I said earlier, we are an industry built on wagering, and that wagering is both what comes directly through our racing product, but also, of course, sports betting contributes significantly to the TAB's overall profitability. So, look, I think in the end we can't react to something that we don't know, but clearly there'll have to be some serious conversations if we were in a situation where there was less income in the industry for a period.
Peter, there's going to be people watching this at home who don't have a lot of money in the bank. They are living like horse trainers in a month-to-month basis, and economically things haven't been great, and they've been hoping something good would happen. Now something bad has happened. From what you heard yesterday coming out of government about the $12 billion plus relief packages to various areas involved in this country, what can people at home do if they are fearful of not being able to pay their rent, or they're a stable hand and they're fearful they're going to lose their job? Because a lot of those words coming out of government yesterday are going to be scary for them and they're not going to fully understand them. Can you try and disseminate some of that information for our viewers inside the industry about what financial lifelines are available to them?
Well, I think that the key opportunity is the wage support that the government has on offer. I think that makes perfect sense, and racing's part of society. That's the reason that we've made the move that we have, and as that is the case, then people in racing running their business have access to the support that the government's offered. So we will be providing more information for people. You do need to have proved a 30% drop in in revenue in any 1 month to be able to access it. And so, again, right now, that probably access isn't available unless people are in that situation themselves through a drop of income for whatever reason that might be, with resources in the stable. It is available. It's available to the race industry as it's available to any other industry. So we'll be disseminating that advice and letting people know. I've had a look, and the ability to access it is pretty straightforward. So that's promising. I think they've made it a simple process, and I know the approval process will be quick. So again, I would encourage people to make themselves aware of what's available, and if they're eligible, then there's no reason they shouldn't apply for that support.
Peter, let's go to the worst possible business scenario, because we know the worst possible human scenario is something we don't want to think about, and we hope we never have to think about. What happens if in a week's time the government says to you, you have to shut down racing? For people watching at home, you may not know the answer to this question, but what happens if there's no harness racing from next week and it lasts for 3 months? What can Harness Racing New Zealand do? What can we do for the participants? What can we do as an industry to survive if that scenario becomes reality?
So that's not a decision that we can make in isolation, Nick. I think that would be a decision that we would make in conjunction with RETA or the TAB, with the other codes who we've been working closely with, and I think also with the government to understand what support would be available to an industry like ours in a situation like that. The reality, as everybody knows, is that there's not a lot of money floating around the industry in terms of what's on the balance sheet, either at RETA or in our case at Harness Racing New Zealand. So what we have to understand is what mechanisms would be in place to support people in the industry if that situation occurred. And as I said, not something that we would do in isolation. We'd certainly be working very hard with government and with RETA to understand what we could do.
Peter, we really appreciate you coming on and trying to give us a bit of an insight into this overall situation. We do understand that it's evolving and changing almost by the hour. Just to touch on a couple of other things away from COVID-19 and the coronavirus, Team Teal and the effort by HRNZ and a whole lot of other people, headed up by Courtney from your organisation, Courtney Clark. I'm sure that you, of all people, would like to acknowledge that they got over $50,000 and created something that, you know, a few years ago wasn't even in New Zealand. The goal was to get to $20,000. To exceed $50,000, there's certainly some plaudits need to go out there.
They do, and certainly it needs to go. Courtney's done a fantastic job coordinating. She's very passionate about it. And of course, the clubs have been hugely supportive. I don't think we could name a club that hasn't got behind it to one degree or another. Lots of people and sponsors in the industry have supported it. And the lady drivers themselves, of course, do a wonderful job. You know, they represent our sport so well. And, you know, I don't think there's a better cause around. So it's one that we're thrilled to be behind. I was at a meeting at Hiranui, of all places, not a tab meeting, of course, but the kids' carts were there and the girls were there with their teal pants, and it looked fantastic. It's got a great feel-good factor to it, and I hope it's something that we can be involved in with some time to come.
Yep, and the support of ovarian cancer and some of the statistics that we'll hear later in the show from Courtney are quite surprising. You may well not really understand just how dangerous this disease is. Also over the weekend, Peter, on a positive note, the Ford Ranger New Zealand Rural Games were held, and at their awards, a couple of our industry participants got recognised. The Lifetime Legacy Award to Ricky May, and I know that he has accepted that on behalf of not only himself but the industry. That was a huge positive. And the young sportswoman of the year went to Sarah O'Reilly, who's just continued on this magnificent run that she's been on.
Absolutely. Like, I was absolutely thrilled for both of them and for our sport to be recognised in such a esteemed company. If you look at the people they're nominated against, it's a real achievement for both Ricky, who represents our sport so well and for such a long time, and then a young woman like Sarah, you know, who's had such great success already, you know, being well supported by people because she's doing a good job. And again, she represents our industry so well. She speaks well, and she's the sort of person that we'd love to have at the face of our sport for many years to come.
Well said. Thanks so much again for your time, Peter. I know it's extremely busy. We'll hope to get updates as they happen from you, and anyone can go to the website. That's the best place to go at this stage. That's where everything will be updated as soon as it happens.
Well, absolutely. Look, we've had quite a bit of feedback, and I would like to say that the majority of the feedback has been very positive. There's one or two people who are upset that they can't attend the course, but most people have seen the bigger picture. And so I'd like to thank all the participants in the industry for the support they're given. As we said at the start, these are extraordinary times, and at the end of the day, you have to take extraordinary measures when you're in that situation. So thanks to everybody, and we wish everybody the best over the coming weeks.